Uh, Posuk Tes Zayin, Posuk Chof. Tzedek Tzedek Tirdof. There's a reiteration of tzedek. Righteousness, righteousness you should pursue. La tichya. So that you should be able to live. V'yorashto es ha'oretz. And you will inherit the land. Asher Hashem Elokecha nosin loch. What is the reiteration of tzedek? Pursue righteousness. Righteousness you should pursue, so you should live. Meaning you will only live as you're meant to live, as a spiritual people, only if righteousness you pursue. And then you will inherit the land. So Rashi in his commentary cites the Sifri, but the Gemara explains it, elaborates and elucidates it a little bit more. Holach achar bezin yofeh. That if you have a choice to go one of two courts, and one court is more qualified than the other court, you should go to the court that's more qualified. Meaning, both courts are no less proficient to adjudicate and rule on this particular case. However, the judges are graded Torah sages, and they're able to elucidate and adjudicate more complicated cases. Although the case you're going for is not as complicated, you need that dimension of judge. If you're able to go to that more advanced stage, go to the more advanced stage rather than the lesser stage. Now the question is why? If the lesser judge is able to adjudicate it, why go to the more advanced stage if he's no less qualified regarding this particular case? But the Torah says, nevertheless, go to the Bezdin Yofeh, the one who's more qualified. We find that initially Moshe had adjudicated all the cases of the Jewish people. Yisro, his father-in-law, comes into the desert and observes what's going on, and he says, it's not the right thing. You're doing the wrong thing. You continue this way, you're going to wither, and the system cannot continue. You should appoint various echelons of judges. The less complicated case, the less a judge should adjudicate. The more complicated one, which they cannot deal with, you're the one who should adjudicate it. And Moshe says, I will consult with Hashem, and if Hashem says yes, then we'll set up this judicial system. Hashem says, Yisro was right, and they set up, that was the basis for the judicial system. Not the basis, as he said, he came upon what the correct approach is, the correct procedure. So the Midrash over there says that ultimately what Moshe was doing, he was doing the correct thing. Ultimately, it couldn't have lasted. But Yisro came with a claim, it's inappropriate that you should sit and people should wait online to be dealt with and to adjudicate their cases. It's not respectful for the Jewish people. Jewish people are special people. So if they wait online for hours till their case could be addressed, it's inappropriate. See, Yisro did not fully appreciate and understand who Moshe Rabbeinu was. If you come and stand before Moshe Rabbeinu, as Chazal, the Midrash tells us, the Shechina was medaberes b'to grono. When he spoke, it's as if actually the word of Hashem was coming out of his mouth. Once you exposed to him and you had that level of contact with him, you became a different person. The influence and the impact and the effect of anybody who was in his presence, his level of spirituality, his capacity of spirituality increased many fold. And Moshe understood that. So waiting online, even for hours or days, so your case should be addressed by Moshe Rabbeinu, stand before him and he will ask you questions. The value of that has greater value. There's no such thing as it's not respectful for the Jewish people. That is the ultimate. If a person, God forbid, has a doctor appointment and only this expert doctor could deal with that particular illness, and he has to diagnose it. That person will wait days. If that person knows that this is the only person who could diagnose it, he'll wait days, and it's not a disrespect that the doctor's making the person wait because he has to tend to other patients which come before that person. That's not disrespectful. Well, get a less qualified doctor. Less qualified doctor doesn't have the experience and the diagnostic skills that he can make that evaluation. But Hashem says factually, even though that may be the case that he doesn't understand, that ultimately it can't continue, because if you want the system to continue, you have to create the system. That's what it's about. Tzedek Tirdof. The Gemara tells us in Sanhedrin that when you stand before the court which is ordained by Moshe Rabbeinu, they're referred to as Elohim, which is the name of Hashem. But Elohim, in this context, does not mean God. It means the judge that's ordained with the ordination of Moshe Rabbeinu. Only that judge, David Bel says in Tilim, Elokim Nitzav Vadas Kel. When these judges, they convene to decide and adjudicate a case, God's presence is there. So when you stand in the presence of that court, you're standing in the presence of the Shekhinah. That's what you're doing. Tzedek Tirdof. The greater the court, the greater the sages, if you're able to choose a more qualified court, not that the lesser court is not qualified to adjudicate the lesser case. They're fully qualified, but nevertheless, it's a different dimension of judge. And because it's a different dimension of the judge, more proficient, a greater Torah sage, the effect and the actually interaction is a different interaction. Therefore, tzedek tirdof. The Midrash says, we say every morning in Psukim de Zimra, that we quote a pasuk from David, that the laws which we were given, the nations of the world are lo yodom. They're not aware of those laws. Only we're aware. So the Midrash asks, what do you mean the laws, which means of dinim, monetary laws, or other laws where a person has to be prosecuted or defended? What do you mean they don't know the laws? They also, the laws, one of the 7 Noahide laws is mishpatim, is dinim. They have to establish a judicial system. So what do you mean lo yodom? What do you mean they're not aware of it? So the Midrash answers that for a non-Jew, a single witness is sufficient to be credible evidence. For a non-Jew, a relative is qualified to testify. For a non-Jew, even a single judge is qualified to preside over the case and render a verdict, to judge the person. For Klal Yisrael, we need 2 qualified witnesses. There are many criteria you have to meet that it should be credible evidence. For monetary, you have to have a bezdin of 3 judges. For death penalty, you have to have a bezdin of 23 of ordained judges. As I said, and the Sanhedrin Gedolah, the High Court of Israel, which is comprised of 70 plus a presiding judge, they have to convene in the chamber of cut stone. Only then the lesser courts could actually rule on laws of capital crime. It's a whole different standard. Now, what's the reason? What's the reason? You know, there's certain laws, the Torah says, acharab lahatos, you go after majority. I gave you the case that we've discussed many times. If you have 10 kosher, you have 10 butcher shops in the community. 9 are kosher, 1 is not kosher. And you find meat on the street. Package of meat, and it has no identification. So don't know from which shop did it come. So you have a ratio of 9 to 1. 9 kosher shops, 1 non-kosher shop. Are you permitted to eat the meat? So the Gemara tells us in a number of locations, acharab lahatos, the Torah says when you have an irresolvable question, you have a right to go after probability. And since it's a 9 to 1 ratio, the probability is that that package of meat came from the kosher shop and you're permitted to eat the meat. Even if afterwards you should find out, after you eat the meat, that the meat was not kosher, you did not violate the law. Because Rove, the law of probability rules, that meat is kosher meat. So what you did at the time was fully permitted. That's the principle of Rove. But yet, even though we have, regarding laws of permitted, not permitted, you have a right to rely on probability, but regarding other things, we don't rely on probability. As we discussed, ein holchem momen acharov, that if you have a majority, probability says that probably was your intent when you purchased the animal. It was for plowing, it was not for slaughtering. If the seller already has the money, you cannot extract your money from the seller. Although majority of people, when they buy oxen, they buy it for plowing and not for selling. Where you find out afterwards the ox was a gora. Where the buyer wasn't clear at the time that he purchased the animal that he was buying it for agricultural purposes, not for slaughtering. Because acharab hatos cannot extract money. There you need credible evidence, which are witnesses. Something not kosher, yes, no, a single witness is believed. A non-qualified witness is believed. A woman, a relative. For monetary or laws of marriage or contracts, all that, you have to have two credible witnesses. And they have to meet certain criteria. Why? Now, we discussed in the past, the Nesivis tells us that there is a concept, the Gemara tells us in Yevamos, that if a person comes back from war and he testifies that he witnessed the person being killed. And that region, there was a war going on, he's not believed to say that the person died. However, a person comes back from a certain community and he tells the Beis Din that a certain man died, although he's a single witness, although he's related, although he's not qualified in other areas to testify, there's a special dispensation leniency when it comes for a woman to remarry. Even a single witness is believed, even a relative is believed. Why? Because since this woman is going to remain a chained woman, meaning she's never going to be able to remarry, so for the sake to allow her to get married, they nullify the marriage retroactively based on the testimony of one witness, although on a Torah level he's not qualified. So if she does remarry, the reason why she's permitted to remarry is because they actually had annulled the marriage. But yet, if that same single witness comes back from a region where there was a war going on, he's not believed. Why? So the Gemara says, because if a war is going on and we see things, we perceive things, we may not perceive them accurately. It's called bididami. Everybody has his own take on something. A person was wounded because it was such a serious moment. He says he was mortally wounded. So he died. So although he probably died, it's not clear he died. And so he may say he died when he didn't die. Therefore, bididami means it appears as if, but when he testifies, it doesn't. He doesn't say it appears as if. He says he definitely died. So the Nesivis says, if you have a single witness, everybody has his take on what he sees. But if you have two witnesses saying the exact same thing, one witness corroborates the other witness's testimony. So that is to guarantee that the testimony is accurate. One, we don't suspect you're lying, but everybody sees it through his own lens. But if you have two people seeing it, and it's the identical lens, then you know clearly the person saw accurately. So that's the concept. So having two rather than one, it brings it to another level of truth, and it's a more credible evidence, and that's what the Torah wants for the Jew. For the non-Jew, probability is sufficient. Single witness, a single judge. We're not talking about he's corrupt, he's lying, where he's suspected. He's not telling the truth. But although he's related, although he's a single witness, although he's a single judge, he's qualified for a non-Jew to give a verdict. Tzedek tirdov. But for a Jew, you need the most credible Beis Din. You have to meet all these criteria of testimony to establish truth beyond any doubt. Why? So that you should live. So because it's having a relation with Hashem. Just as we mentioned, that the signet of God is truth, and truth means uncompromised truth. Identically, the testimony that's offered in the Beis Din has to be at that level of truth. Therefore, whatever is within the human being's capacity to establish and to corroborate the fact that it should be truth beyond any doubt, therefore these laws are set in place. So as a result of that, therefore what God demands of the Jew, he doesn't demand of the non-Jew. You know, it's interesting. The law is that if a Jew's life, God forbid, is in jeopardy, it overrides the whole Torah. If a Jew has to go, is not well on Shabbos, and it's a question of life and death, you violate the Shabbos. If he has to eat non-kosher, and if he doesn't, he will, even questionably, he may die, he eats non-kosher. Why? Because Torah says, v'chai b'hem. You should live by my Torah, not die for my Torah. So v'chai b'hem, the human life is always the overriding factor, except the three exceptions. Adultery, incest, idolatry, and murder. And the Gemara tells us in Psochim and Sanhedrin that the Jew was given an ultimatum by a non-Jew. Either you kill so-and-so or we kill you. So over there it's a question of his life, and it's no question, his life's at stake. Is he permitted to take the life of another Jew to save his own life? So the law is he's not permitted. Why? So the Gemara says it's a rational concept. Because my choz is the domach sumach tveim midmei chavroch. Who said your blood is any redder than your fellow's blood? Who said your life has any greater value than your fellow's life? So Rashi explains, the reason why the Torah says that the Jew's life is always the overriding factor is because the soul of the Jew is precious to Hashem. And it's so precious, it overrides the Torah. But what about I'm pitting a life against a life? Who said your life in God's eyes is more precious than the Jew who they tell you to take his life? So since only God knows whose life is more precious, therefore you have no right to take the life of the other Jew. So it's a whole different concept. Chai B'hem is always, the Torah is as precious and special as it may be, even though the world was created for its fulfillment, but it doesn't have the value of the life, the preciousness of a Jewish soul. Therefore, it's always the overriding factor. But if it's a question of a life for a life, we're not dealing with what has greater value, the Torah or the life. Who says your life has greater value than the other person's life? That's the idea. But what about if it will be a non-Jew's life? It's only Nishmas Yisrael. It's only why? Because as it says, Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'ha'aretz. Of course, the world was created b'shul Yisrael shenikra reishis, b'shul Torah shenikra seisus. The Jewish people are the essence of creation. It was created specifically for them because only they are able to fulfill the Torah. As a result of that, the Jewish life, again, why is the standard for a Jew and not for a non-Jew? Because the Jew is precious because only he can have that intimate relation with God. Therefore, if God's signet is truth, unadulterated truth, absolute truth, therefore it has to be at that standard. Therefore, what the Torah demands of the Jew regarding testimony or the court system or all these issues, it has to be beyond any doubt, because only then could you inherit the land which God gave you. Because everything is about having the relationship with Hashem for that reason. Any comments, Alan?
Rabbi?
Yes.
Rabbi, in the probability issue, when you mentioned the kosher meat found on the street, and there are 9 kosher shops and 1 non-kosher shop, would it matter at all if the meat was found outside the kosher shop?
Be right at the doorstep.
Yeah, or very close proximity.
The Gemara discusses that. You have a situation.
Change the,
Yep. There's a question. It's called Rov Karov. If you have probability and you have proximity. The case, exactly the case we're speaking about. The proximity, it's right in front of the shop. But the probability is it's a 9-1, because it's still possible that somebody had dropped the meat outside the kosher shop. He bought it at the non-kosher shop, and as he was walking, he dropped it outside the non-kosher shop. You still go after Rove. You still go after the majority. It's called Rove or Korov. If you have majority and proximity, Korov, it's close, the probability is always the overriding factor. But let's say it was literally found in the doorway of the kosher shop. That's more than Korov. That's more than proximity. There, it's evident somebody, as he was walking out of the shop, dropped it right at the doorway as he was about to walk out. Somebody went into a supermarket, non-kosher supermarket, and he brought a package of meat from the kosher butcher, and he forgot the package in the supermarket. So, they sell non-kosher meat in the supermarket. Oh, well, maybe a Jew had bought it at a kosher shop, and he forgot his package in the non-kosher supermarket. Therefore, the meat is kosher meat. I mean, we don't say, of course, the majority of the meat in the community sold is kosher meat. Their probability is this package was left by a person who bought the meat in the kosher shop, where they sell non-kosher meat in the supermarket itself, and they package the meat similarly as this package was packaged. This meat was packaged. Jake, Mark, good. Looks like Mark didn't sleep much last night. Mark, what's happening?
No, I was up late last night, Robert, just dealing with some stuff in New York. But just two things. So these are, I think, yes or no questions. So if a Jew's faced with the choice between killing a non-Jew or being murdered, the answer is...
The internet, I don't think, is great here. Hello? Alan? It's frozen.
I'm sorry. Could you not hear me? I apologize.
No, it's the internet. I'm at a hotel. That's the reason. I don't think the internet here is even worse than yesterday. How's the internet, Jay?
I'll try one more time.
Try. I heard what you asked. I heard what you asked.
Okay.
I'll tell you a story. There's a work of essays or responsa. It's called Chuvas Mimamakim. It's responsive from the depths. There was a shul on the Lower East Side. It was called Beis Medrash HaGadol. The rabbi his name was Rabbi Oshri. And when the Nazis took over Kovna, he was the Rav of that community. And he had many questions that were asked him. And they were very serious questions. One of the questions was, if the Nazis would say to the Jews, we want you to give over a certain Jew, and if not, we're going to kill 20 people. What do? Do you let 20 Jews be killed, or you give over that one Jew? If a person is able to pay off to bribe the Nazi to save your own child, but if you save your child, he's taking another child, do you have a right to bribe the Nazi to save your child, where another child's life can be taken in the place of your child? Are you permitted to do these? These are the questions he was asked. And he recorded these questions. And the many questions he says, I'm not qualified to answer the question. That because of it was the level of seriousness. So he said, I'm not qualified to answer the question. You understand? I mean, there's certain questions. This question wasn't asked. Because the halacha is based on the Gemara. There's certain things we don't make public knowledge. Because it becomes public knowledge, as we said, you're permitted to save the life of a non-Jew on Shabbos. Because if the non-Jew feels that his life is less valued than the Jew's life, then the Jew's life is in jeopardy. So the reason why the doctor is permitted to attend to the medical needs of a non-Jew, because if he doesn't, it's pikuach nefesh for the Jew. Because then Jews are not, their lives are going to be in jeopardy, because either they won't receive the medical attention, or it'll create a reaction from the non-Jew. They don't value us, we don't value them, and our lives will be in jeopardy. But in terms of just the basic facts, the fact is, if it would be just saving the life of the non-Jew, for the non-Jew, where it's not a question of Jewish life is in question, the Jew is not permitted to violate Shabbos to save the life of the non-Jew. Because Torah only says, V'chai bem, the Jewish life overrides the Torah. The non-Jewish life does not override the Torah. Mark, You understand what I'm saying? And that is the halacha. I'll give you a very interesting thing. You know, when it comes to chesed, there is the Satmar Bika Cholim, and Alan knows this. Anybody who's in the hospital, especially in New York City, Manhattan, Brooklyn, there's a Bika Cholim. It's called Satmar Bika Cholim. Every day, they go from room to room, and they bring food for the families who are in the hospital. Not only for the patient who's not well, even the family that's in the room or the family that's going to be with the patient, they will bring food for him every day of the week, even for Shabbos meals. And it's given with such consideration and with such sensitivity that if they give you, are you satisfied? Do you want more? Would you want another menu? I mean, it's not to be believed the level of chesed they do and the way they do it. So I remember many years ago, my father was in the hospital, nothing very serious, and the Satmar Bika Cholim comes, and it wasn't a private room, so he had another patient was there, not Jewish, and the family was there, and the woman comes in, and she comes in with sandwiches. And of course, my father was the patient, so he was on a special whatever it is, he couldn't eat it. But my mother, maybe another family member was there, and they said, would you have some food? And they gave the sandwiches. So the family of the non-Jew said, do you have enough sandwiches for us? She says, we don't have enough for you. We don't have enough for you. It's already reserved for other people in other rooms. But factually, I'm sure she could have come up with another sandwich. Because the halacha, the law of tzedakah, a Jew has no obligation of charity to a non-Jew. The obligation of charity is only to a Jew, not to a non-Jew. A Jew has no obligation to do chesed with a non-Jew. Of course, it's a Kiddush Hashem. If you do it, it's a Kiddush Hashem. But you're not in violation if you withhold chesed from a non-Jew. But if you withhold chesed from a Jew, that's a Torah violation. Why? Because a Jew is your brother. The non-Jew is not your brother. We're responsible for one another. And therefore, if we can help one another, as it says, the prophet says you should not abandon your flesh. And when you're in a position to help and you don't, that's like turning your back on your brother. And the Torah says a Jew is not permitted to turn his back on his brother for that reason. Mark, you satisfied with that or not? Excuse me.